Hello Finxters. Welcome to this article and video, which is an introduction to classes in Python, and this will be broken into two parts. We'll start with some of the basics here, and then we'll move on in the second part to some of the more advanced components of classes. So in this video, we're going to be talking about briefly object-oriented programming. We won't go into it in great detail because there is a lot of information out there about that, but it's effectively talking about why we would use that versus procedural programming. We'll talk briefly on objects and classes and how they work together and fit in with the OOP theory. Then within classes, we'll identify a few of their components. We'll talk about variables, class variables. We'll talk about the attributes. We'll talk about methods and the function init, and within that function, the self and how that works. And then we'll create a class. We'll create an object from that class, and then we'll interrogate the object attributes. Then finally, we'll add methods to our class, which will return information regarding our object. So quickly on procedural programming, if you're anything like me, you started your programming with a whole basket full of functions at the top of your code, and then you pass data back and forth from code to functions, effectively breaking down the larger problem you wanted to solve between a whole lot of different functions and a whole lot of different code. Quite messy. It got the job done, but it was quite untidy. There was a lot of repetition. There was a lot of passing from one to another. Very hard to follow. Very hard to follow even after a week or two when you go back to it. Even harder for someone who comes along who comes in cold and has to review it. So it does work. It's the way we all start, but it's much better if we can get into using the power of Python and object-oriented programming. And effectively what that's about is creating reusable code. And what we're doing is we're utilizing classes which will act as a blueprint for an object. So it's a template. And that class will then have variables, attributes, and methods which we can apply to an object. And we can create as many objects as we like from that class, and they will all contain those variables, attributes, and methods. Obviously, the attributes will be, the values of the attributes will be specific to each object, but it's just a very, very efficient way of using code. And we then create an instance of an object from a class. So I suggest rather than talk about it, because it's an abstract concept, let's go and do some coding, and as we go through, we'll just talk through the specific issues. Alright, so here I have a bit of code which is creating a class. And let's just step through it line by line. So to create a class, you literally just use the word class, space, and the name of the class that you wish to apply, whatever it happens to be. And in this instance, I'm assuming that we're a small grocery store and I want to create the genesis of a stock management program. And rather than have to do every single piece on its own, I will create a class which will then form a template for my grocery items. So we've created a class stock : return, and now we've come down, and what I'd like to do is apply what's called a class variable. And a class variable is exactly what it sounds like. There's your variable category, and I've passed it a grocery item string. A class variable is something that applies to every object that is created from that class. So every time we get an instance of an object which is of this class, it will be of category grocery item. If I change that to machinery part, then every object will change to machinery part. So it's a global change. So that's a class variable. Then we come down to attributes. We wish to define attributes for our object. But of course, all the different objects will have different values of attributes, but they will have the same attribute. So what we're going to do here is we're going to apply a number of attributes that I feel grocery items should have and which I will need to be able to track and make use of this data. So we once again def to define, and then we use the initialize, the dunder init function, which is $_init open bracket. And from there we use the word self. Now a lot of people struggle with this, and in my head I just see it as a placeholder for the object. Don't forget, this is just a template. We don't know what the objects are going to be. They will all be different. It might be a can of beans, it might be a piece of meat, it might be a piece of cheese, whatever it is. So self is effectively a placeholder for that object. It's not something you need to worry about. Just write in the word self and comma. It needs to be there. It doesn't have to be self. You can use whatever word you like. There just needs to be a placeholder there for the object. Then following that will be the particular parameters that you want to pass to the object. So these parameters will be common across all the objects you create. So I know I want a stock code. I'd like to know the description of the item. I'd like to know what I bought it for, and I'd like to know what markup I'm adding to that to ultimately sell it. So I've got 4 parameters that I will need to pass to this class to actually create an object. Colon. Then under here, what we're effectively doing is we're creating the attributes that we wish. So we've got the parameters up here. Here's the same parameters down the right hand side, stock code, description, buy price, markup, same as you've got there, and we are passing them to the attributes that the object will have. So any object that is created from this class will have code, description, buy, and margin as the attributes. And once again, we use self.code because if we call it, we will use the object name. Object name.code will return the stock code of the item. So I'm going to stop here. There's lots more we can do, but we'll get on to methods shortly. So at the moment we've talked about how we actually create a class. We've talked about class variables, which are a global thing, and then we've talked about defining the attributes that the object will have and how we pass the parameters to those attributes. And right now what I think we should do is go and create an object, and you can see how simple that is, and then we'll interrogate it. Let's do that. Alright, so what we have here is we have this line, line 14, is where we're actually creating an instance of an object from class stock. And what we're doing is we're calling class stock, and then in the brackets we have to pass the 4 parameters that we've entered in here: stock code, description, buy price, markup. So I've got a stock code C298, description chicken soup, 75 cents purchase, and a 1.553 markup that I intend to apply to it. That there will create the object and pass it to C298. So C298 will be the object which will contain these attributes. Then what I think we should do is we'll print C298, and you'll see what comes from that, and then we'll print the directory of C298, and I will find those attributes in that directory. Let's do that now. So you can see print C298 has returned an object which is at that memory location, and it's of class stock. And when we've called a directory on that object, there's all the things that it possesses, and you'll see the function init is in there as one of them. But let's just scroll right to the end, and down the end you'll see there is the class variable category, And there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of the attributes which contain the values that we entered there. So what I think we'll do is we'll go and interrogate those values. And the way we do that is, as I said, we're simply calling c298.code. And so c298.code will return the stock code. The same for all of those. And then I've just done a string down the bottom, which will just put together the information in a readable format. So we're going to run that. And there you can see we have category grocery item. So that's that one. It's chicken soup, 75 cents, 1.553, and the stock code is C298. And then using the formatted string, we have in the grocery item category, we have chicken soup at a cost price of 75 cents. So on this screen, what we've learned is we've learned how to create a class, we've learned how to add a class variable, and we've learned how to add the initialization component, which will initialize an object with attributes which it gains from the parameters that we will pass when we instantiate or create an instance of that object. Now what I want to do is move across and talk a little bit about methods. So let's do that. So we're back on effectively the same screen, but what we've done now is we've added some methods in here. And remember, we spoke about class variables, we talked about attributes, now we're going to talk about methods. And I like to think of methods as effectively functions. They're just the same thing. So what we're doing is we're defining within the class stock a function that has access to all of these attributes and variables, and it can act on them. It can use them, it can change them, there's a lot it can do. So we've defined two functions here. The reason I've defined two is one, I want to show you which is simply a function that doesn't need any parameters or arguments passed to it. It's literally sell price, sell underscore price, self, and if we activate that, it will print the retail price equals dollars, and it will carry out a quick calculation of the buy price times the margin, and it'll round that to 2 decimal places and return that for us. So it'll give us the selling price. And then the second one does require some arguments or parameters being passed to it, and that is we have a sale, and if we want to activate a sale on any particular object, we can call that, but we need to pass the discount that we wish to pass. And then it will give us the discounted price, and effectively it takes the buy price times the margin as we did previously, and then adds in the discount, rounds it to 2 decimal places and returns it. So just the same as functions out in the real world, but we're inside a class here, and so it's acting on the attributes and the variables in this class. So let's interrogate that and see what happens. And so once again, we create an instance of an object using the stock class, and we're passing to it the stock code, the description, the price we bought it for, and the price we're going to mark it up. But now what we're going to do is we're going to call that sell price method, and then we're going to call the sale method, but we need to remember to put in the discount amount. So in this case, we're going to ask for a sell price, and then we're going to ask for a sale price, assuming we're applying a 15% discount. And let's see how that goes. And there you see down the bottom, the sell price, normal retail price of that item is $1.16, and the discounted price with the 15% discount will be selling that can of chicken soup at 99 cents. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll talk in the second part of this article and video about a few other things that we can do within classes. But we've learnt a lot here. We've learnt how to create a class. We've learnt about class variables. We've learnt about attributes that can be applied to an object through the passage of parameters. And then we've learnt about methods, class methods, that will then be able to act on or carry out tasks and do things to the attributes or to the variables and return information to us. So let's go back to the slides. So just to summarize where we got to in part one of this, we discussed object-oriented programming and why it's preferable to procedural programming. It's just a much more efficient way of doing things, and it works with the DRY acronym for programming, which is don't repeat yourself. So object-oriented programming is a much more efficient way of doing things. We talked about classes and how they work in OOP, and we introduce you today to class variables, to attributes and methods, and we spoke on the init function and self and what that's for. We created a class, and then we created an instance of an object using that class and interrogated the object to return its attributes. And then finally we created two methods, one without parameters and one with, just so that you could see that once again, like a function, you can do both. And then we used the methods to carry out functions on our object and return a result. So thank you so much for watching this. I hope that was helpful. We've got you part way there. Don't forget to come back for part 2 of Python classes, and we're going to be talking about something called inheritance, encapsulation, and polymorphism. So we'll cover all that in part 2. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2.